faint echo of footsteps on marble floors, the distant whisper of silk against stone. In the gilded halls of Versailles, death arrives not as a sudden visitor, but as a slow, creeping horror that would transform the most powerful man in Europe into a living nightmare. The year is 1715, August 11th. The Sun King has returned from his final hunt. Louis XIV, the monarch who declared himself the living embodiment of France, who built a palace so magnificent it redefined royal power itself, feels a sharp pain pierce through his left leg. It's nothing, surely, a mere twinge after hours in the saddle. But this pain carries within it the seeds of a death so horrifying, so prolonged, that it would haunt the corridors of Versailles for weeks to come. For 72 years, Louis had worn the crown of France. For 77 years, he had drawn breath. He was a man who commanded armies, who moved the very borders of nations with a gesture, who believed himself chosen by God. Yet now, in the twilight of his reign, something infinitely smaller would bring him to his knees, something that would make him rot from within while still alive. This is the story of how the Sun King became a dying candle, flickering in agony while his court watched in silent terror. The weight of a crown. To understand the horror of Louis XIV's final days, we must first comprehend the man himself. Born in 1638, Louis ascended to the throne at age 4, but didn't begin his personal rule until 1661. For over half a century, he had been the undisputed master of Europe's most powerful kingdom. He was Le Roi Soleil, the Sun King, around whom all of France orbited. Louis XIV's verified reign of 72 years and 110 days is the longest of any monarch in history. He had transformed a medieval court into the epitome of absolute monarchy. Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a statement written in marble and gold that declared, "Here lives a god among men." But gods, as history teaches us, are not immune to mortality. Louis had always been robust, athletic even in his youth. He loved the hunt, the dance, the elaborate ceremonies that reinforced his divine status. Yet by his 60s, the relentless pace of kingship had begun to take its toll. By 66, his health had become poor, spirits low, and his teeth almost all gone. The king who had once danced for hours now struggled with the simplest physical tasks. Yet nothing could have prepared him, or his horrified court, for what was to come. The first whisper of death. On August 11, 1715, Louis felt a sudden intense pain in his left leg. In the grand narrative of royal deaths, this moment seems almost mundane. A twinge, a discomfort. Kings suffer minor ailments all the time. But this was different. Guy Crescent-Fagan, the king's head physician, diagnosed it as sciatica, a common condition, nothing more. He prescribed what royal doctors always prescribed, a purgative: empty the bowels, balance the humors, restore the king to health. It was the medicine of an age that understood little about the microscopic enemies that could bring down even the mightiest rulers. Fagan chalked it up to sciatica and prescribed a purgative. But when the pain increased to the point where he couldn't even walk the short distance to Madame de Maintenon's chambers, Fagan was finally persuaded to call in consulting physicians. As the days passed, the pain didn't subside. It grew, it gnawed, it consumed. The king, who had walked through the hall of mirrors to the sound of courtiers' whispered reverence, now couldn't cross his own bedchamber without assistance. Something was terribly, catastrophically wrong. The mark of corruption. On August 17th, everything changed. Maréchal continued to massage the leg because it was the only thing that made him feel better, even if just for an hour. And on August 17th, he saw that a red spot on the leg had developed into a sore. A single red spot. Such a small thing to herald such enormous suffering. But Maréchal, the king's surgeon, knew what it meant. He had seen it before, in soldiers returning from battlefield wounds, in patients whose bodies had begun to betray them. This wasn't sciatica. This wasn't a simple pain that could be massaged away or purged from the system. This was gangrene. The surgeon now realized the king had gangrene, that only amputation could save his life. Gangrene, the word itself, carries the weight of medieval dread. Gangrene causes tissue to decay, most commonly due to issues with the blood supply or diabetes. Usually, when a limb is gangrened, it becomes blue, purple, or black. It's the body consuming itself, tissue by tissue, in a process that cannot be stopped, only slowed. For a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by beauty, by art, By the finest things human civilization could create, gangrene represented the ultimate corruption. It was ugliness incarnate, spreading through the very flesh that had been anointed with holy oil at his coronation. The stench of mortality. What followed was a horror that defied the gilded magnificence of Versailles. Despite excruciating pain, the king carried on with his daily routine without flinching, fully intending to do his duty to the end. Even as his body began to decay around him, Louis XIV remained, in his mind, the Sun King. Court ceremonies continued. Audiences were granted. The elaborate rituals of absolute monarchy persevered, even as death crept up the royal leg. But the smell was inescapable. Suffering from the affliction is agonizing, but also a rather smelly affair. When Louis XIV was on his deathbed, the courtiers were unwilling to stay anywhere near his bedchamber due to the stench. Imagine the scene. The most opulent palace in Europe, its air usually perfumed with the finest essences, now thick with the putrid odor of rotting flesh. Courtiers who had spent their lives competing for the privilege of serving the king now fled from his presence, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The gangrene worsened, and on the 26th it had spread to his bone, from a single red spot to corruption that reached the very foundation of his leg. The infection was winning, consuming the king piece by piece, day by agonizing day. The living corpse. By late August, Louis XIV had become something unprecedented in the annals of monarchy, a king dying in public, rotting before the eyes of his court. However, on 25th August, the day of St. Louis, he was forced to remain in bed, and thereafter never left his bedchamber. The man who had made Versailles the center of European culture, who had received ambassadors from across the known world, was now confined to a single room. But even there, the rituals continued. Even there, the monarchy persisted. His servants dressed him up, complete with a high wig, and for a week he held court from his bed, repeatedly saying his last farewells and yet failing to die. Picture this macabre theater. The dying king, his wig perfectly positioned, his royal robes arranged to hide the horror beneath, holding court as his body literally decomposed around him. It was performance art of the most ghastly kind, a final demonstration of the distance between the man and the myth he had created. The doctors, meanwhile, remained helpless. In an age before antibiotics, before modern surgical techniques, gangrene was essentially a death sentence. The doctors were powerless. They could only watch as France's most powerful man slowly rotted alive. The final wisdom. Even in his agony, even as corruption spread through his flesh, Louis XIV displayed a clarity that had perhaps eluded him during his years of glory and conquest. That same day, the king received his 5-year-old great-grandson, the future Louis XIV, to give him advice. The scene is almost unbearable to contemplate. A 5-year-old child, the future of the monarchy, brought to the bedside of his rotting ancestor. What did the boy see? What did he smell? What lessons did he learn about the fragility of power, about the democracy of death? According to Philippe de Courcillon's journal, Louis on his deathbed advised his heir with these words, "Do not follow the bad example which I have set you. I have often undertaken war too lightly, and have sustained it for vanity." The man who had spent decades at war, who had expanded France's borders through conquest and blood, now spoke of war's vanity. The king who had built Versailles, who had lived in unprecedented luxury while his people suffered, now understood the cost of his choices. Reportedly, Louis XIV told the soon-to-be Louis XV that he had loved war too much, that it was the ruination of the people, that he should not imitate his taste for expensive construction, that he should spend money alleviating the suffering of his people instead. These were the words of a man facing not just death, but judgment. As gangrene consumed his flesh, perhaps Louis finally understood that all his glory, all his magnificence, all his claims to divine authority meant nothing when faced with the simple biological reality of infection and decay. The autopsy of a god. Louis died of gangrene at Versailles on 1st September 1715, 4 days before his 77th birthday, after 72 years on the throne. His death, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Enduring much pain in his last days, he finally yielded up his soul without any effort, like a candle going out, while reciting the Psalm Deus in Adjutorium me festina. But death was not the end of the horror. It was, in many ways, just the beginning of a new revelation. The next day his body was autopsied, a long-standing custom for members of the royal family. L'ouverture, the opening, as the procedure was called, was performed on the state dining table before an array of courtiers and doctors. The autopsy revealed the full extent of what gangrene had done to the Sun King. The exterior of the left side was found gangrenous from the extremity of the foot to the top of the head, the skin peeling everywhere, but less on the right than on the left, the body extremely distended and bloated. From a single red spot had spread corruption that consumed nearly half his body. The infection had not been content with his leg. It had claimed territory across his entire form, transforming the Sun King into a landscape of decay. The interior of the left thigh, where the king's disease began, was completely gangrenous in every part, all the blood in all the vessels totally disorganized and very scanty in amount. This was the final lesson of Louis XIV, that beneath the silk and gold, beneath the rhetoric of divine right and absolute power, lay only flesh, vulnerable, mortal, ultimately insignificant flesh that could be conquered by something as small as a bacterial infection. The echo of corruption. The death of Louis XIV marked more than the end of a reign. It marked the end of an illusion. For 72 years, he had successfully convinced Europe, and perhaps himself, that he was something more than human. Versailles was built to reinforce this myth, its mirrors reflecting not just light, but the idea that its inhabitant was touched by divinity. But gangrene doesn't recognize divine right. Infection doesn't bow to royal authority. Death comes for kings as surely as it comes for peasants. And sometimes it comes with particular cruelty for those who have forgotten their mortality. The courtiers who fled the stench of the royal bedchamber carried with them a truth that would eventually help topple the monarchy itself. Kings bleed, kings suffer, kings rot. They are men, nothing more, dressed in fine clothes and surrounded by ceremony, but still just men. Louis XIV must be one of the best examples of image protection in European history. It's hard to picture him as an invalid literally decaying in his own bed. Even today we struggle to reconcile the Sun King of popular imagination with the reality of his final weeks. A man in agony, his body consuming itself, his courtiers fleeing from the smell of his decay. Yet perhaps this darker truth is more important than all the glittering ceremonies, all the artistic achievements, all the military victories. Perhaps the real lesson of Louis XIV lies not in his glory, but in his gangrene. The candle goes out. In the end, the Sun King's light was extinguished not by revolution or conquest, but by something infinitely smaller and more mundane. A bacterial infection, a failure of circulation, the simple, inevitable corruption that waits for every living thing. His body was divided after death, following ancient tradition. His heart to one church, his entrails to another, his corpse to yet another. Even in death, he was dismantled, scattered, reduced to component parts. The man who had unified France under his absolute will was himself fragmented in the end. The revolution would come later. The monarchy would fall. The royal tombs would be desecrated, the reliquaries destroyed. The royal tombs and reliquaries of France were desecrated and destroyed during the French Revolution. Louis XIV's heart was sold to an artist to use in the production. Even his preserved heart became nothing more than material for paint. But long before the revolutionary crowd stormed the palace, long before the guillotine claimed other royal heads, the illusion of divine monarchy had already died in a bed in Versailles, consumed by gangrene, surrounded by the stench of corruption and the whispered prayers of a dying man who finally understood that he was mortal after all. The Sun King had taught Europe about absolute power. In the end, he taught them something more valuable. Absolute power is absolutely vulnerable to the simple, inexorable democracy of death. And in the silence that followed his final breath, you could almost hear it. The sound of an entire age dying with him, rotting away like flesh touched by gangrene, leaving behind only the memory of what happens when men forget they are merely men, and when kings discover that crowns cannot protect them from the corruption that waits in every shadow. Patient as winter, certain as the grave.